All right, so now that we're able to log into our application and basically use it the same way that we were before, let's give ourselves a way to log out of our application so that we can continue working on the login and create account pages. Now, the way that we're going to do this is basically by editing the nav bar up at the top here so that in addition to having this My Profile button, it also has a button that will allow us to log out. All right, and we're also going to do that thing where we basically change the buttons that are displayed up at the top here depending on whether or not the user is currently logged in. Right, and we can do this, remember, because when we added our user provider to our application, if we open up our app.js component here, remember that we wrapped our entire application inside of this. So essentially all of the components inside this user provider can access the data that it contains. So here's what this is going to look like. We're going to open up our navbar component, and I'm just going to close a lot of these components because we don't need them anymore. We're going to open up our navbar component, and up at the top here, the first thing we're going to do is import the useContext hook from React and the user context from its own file. So import user context from, this is going to be /contexts/user context. And we're going to start off by getting whether or not the user is logged in from this context by saying const is loading and user equals useContext user context. And then we're going to use these two things to basically determine what we end up displaying inside our navbar. So the friend tracker heading, that's going to stay the same, and we're going to want that to be displayed no matter what, right? That's the logo of our site, so we'll want to display that whenever we can. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is basically we're going to wrap this My Profile button inside some logic. So let's wrap that inside curly braces here. And we're going to start off by looking at whether or not the current user is actually loading, right? If we don't know whether the user is logged in or not, because our app is still communicating with Firebase, we're going to just want to display a loading message here, or nothing at all, by saying is loading. Okay, and if it's loading, what we're going to do is we're going to display just a basic loading message here. Again, you can display nothing if you want, just by putting null there instead. Right? If it's loading, it's going to display that. Otherwise, it will check if the user is logged in or not by saying ! user. Okay, if the user exists, we want to display this My Profile button, and we want to display a logout button. So let's add another button here with the same class name as our other button. We'll say class name equals styles.profile button. And we might actually want to change the name of that style since it's no longer just the profile button. And for this, we're going to say log out. Okay, we're going to need to wrap these as well inside React fragments here, just like that. Okay, so that's what happens if a user is logged in. If the user is not logged in, we're going to basically display a button for going to the login page and a button for going to the create account page. So we're going to say, here, you know what? We can actually just copy and paste this button here. We're going to do it twice. We're going to wrap that in a React fragment. And the next thing we're going to do is basically just make this go to the login page. So we'll say login. We'll send that to the login route, and we'll do the same thing for the create account route. We'll say create-account, which we still haven't created yet, by the way. And we're going to make this button say create account. All right, and let's change the name of this style here from profile button to something more like action button. So we're going to open up navbar.module.css. We're going to change profile button to action button. And we'll change that in all of these as well. So we'll say styles.action button, styles.action button, and styles.action button, styles.action button. You probably could have just done a find and replace here for this, but whatever, it's done now. Okay, so that should be all of the logic that we need to determine which buttons are displayed in the nav bar depending on whether or not the user is logged in. So the next thing we're going to do is allow the user to actually log out by clicking on this button. Now, in order to do this, we're just going to import Firebase's signout function by saying import its get auth and sign out from Firebase auth. And essentially, we're just going to have a function here which will be called sign out or log out. Right, since that seems to be the terminology that the rest of our app is using, we'll call it logout. And that's going to be equals async. And we're going to say const auth equals get auth. And then we're going to say await sign out and pass auth as an argument there. Okay, so now we just need to make this button here, this logout button rather. We need to make that call that logout function by saying onClick equals logout. And that should be all we need to do. So let's test this thing by heading over to our app. There it is. Oops, and it looks like the styling here is a little funky. We'll come back and fix that in a minute. But let's try clicking on logout. And we should see that the buttons change accordingly, which is pretty cool. All right, so let's just go correct those styles for our buttons. All we're going to do for that is just remove display flex from the nav bar. And for our action button, we're going to add margin right equals 8 pixels. And that should make it so that our buttons are right next to each other. So let's just add a little bit of margin to our buttons at the top. So we'll just say margin top. We'll set that to, let's try 8 pixels and see how that looks. Let's do a little bit more. We'll do 16 pixels. There we go, that looks good. So that is our nav bar, and as I mentioned, it changes when we actually log in. So if we try logging in here now, we'll see that these buttons up here are going to change, and we should see, boom, it changes like that. Now, one last thing that we can do as well is display the email of the currently logged in user to show them who they're currently logged in as. And the way that we would do that, it's actually quite simple, seeing as though we already have this user object. We just need to say, right here next to our My Profile button, we're going to say paragraph logged in as, and we're going to display the user's email by saying user.email. Okay, so if we go back here now, we should see, oops, it messed up the styling here, but we should see that it does say logged in as sean@gmail.com. So let's actually just fix those things now. We're just going to add some styles to this. We're just going to say style equals float right. And actually, let's just put that down here so that it will display in the correct order since we're using float right. And sure enough, we see that it says logged in as sean@gmail.com. Now, let's just add one or two more styles to this. We're just going to say margin. In fact, let's actually just use the action button style. We're going to say class name equals styles.actionButton, and you might want to change the name of that style again to make it more, more relevant to the fact that we're now displaying something that isn't actually an action button. But I'm just going to leave that for now because it should look fairly good. Okay, so that's how to incorporate Firebase Auth into an existing navigation bar. And, this one's been a little bit different from before because it now has this My Profile button that we're displaying that'll take us to the user profile. But ultimately, it's pretty similar to what we've seen before, with, of course, the notable difference that we're now getting our user state from context instead of just from a custom hook. So anyway, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.